Well, good evening.
Good evening.
So the first class had to learn this. Good evening.
Good evening.
Oh, good. Sounds like everybody's ready to roll. It is Wednesday, June 2nd, 2010. And this is the first class of our second block of classes. And we will begin for these next 4 sessions on our block, Discovering the Old Testament. Now, for many of you, perhaps this is rediscovering the Old Testament. It's there every Sunday when we have our church services. We take readings from the Old Testament. We read from Psalms. Much of our liturgy, whether we know it or not, are pulled directly as almost quotations from what we might refer to as the law and the prophets, but throughout the books of the Old Testament. In our block of classes, the Introduction to the Bible, I asserted that within the Bible, though there were 66 diverse books, there was a great and profound, a holy, unitive whole. It is a single narrative, a single story. And that though there were many voices over many centuries, that it was like a great symphony, where the different elements of the symphony, the different instruments or pieces of the orchestra, all sounded together in their own unique ways, in their own unique times, but to produce that one glorious song. And from beginning to end, from Alpha to Omega. Priscilla, would you leave that on, please? It gets a little too dark on the camera.
Want to turn this one off?
That there is a cohesion, a coherence, and there is a singular story from beginning to end. God's love story to His people, God's love story to us. So whether it's discovering the Old Testament for the first time or rediscovering, taking a chance to kind of brush up on your fundamentals and get back to the basics for a bit, I hope there is something in these next few classes that will either encourage you, it will affirm you, it will ignite an interest or maybe even a passion to take this first section of God's love story of His holy word and read it again with new, fresh, eager eyes and eager hearts. You almost have to start any kind of talk about spending time in the Old Testament with, I think, answering the implicit question, why bother? In the same way that we talked about the benefits of Bible study as a whole and having the Bible and reading the Bible, I think that, especially within the Christian church, there seems to be kind of an implicit, well, what's the big deal with the Old Testament? I mean, it's good and everything. I'm glad it's there. But what's in it for me? It's kind of hard. And it's kind of confusing. And if you just open up a random section, okay, totally random. Moreover, you know also what Joab the son of Zeruiah did to me, how he dealt with the 2 commanders of the armies of Israel, Abner the son of Ner, and Amasa the son of Jether, whom he murdered, avenging in time of peace blood which had been shed in war, and putting innocent blood upon the girdle about my loins, and upon the sandals on my... What? Totally random, and yet we're filled with confusing names, references to stories that we have probably little idea what they're talking about, and some kind of cultural things happening that either puzzle us completely or potentially even frighten or disgust us. So it's a really, really foreign book to most Christians. And if we're all about Jesus, well, He's in the Gospels. And if we're all about doctrine, well, that's in the epistles. And the Old Testament, I mean, okay. I mean, I'm glad it's there, but it's sort of like, I'm glad that there are structural engineers who can build bridges. I benefit from their expertise, but I don't have the slightest idea how to do it myself. Good thing that somebody knows how to do it, glad it ain't me. So maybe the Old Testament is like that it's kind of confusing, or it's kind of hard, or you hit some of those genealogies and it's page after page of beget. Or you get into something like Leviticus, and you've got all these laws and all these rules, and some of them you're just like, well, why can't I eat that? And I'm supposed to do what? With what? So, taken as discrete pieces, the foreignness and the unfamiliarity with the times and the places and the language and the culture of the Old Testament can seem almost insurmountable. So, what's the big deal? And why bother? I mean, maybe you can say, well, it's just good to learn, that there's some kind of benefit in exposing ourselves to this, or, you know, since we do read it in the church, I guess I should kind of read it. And so it's kind of like, it's sort of like eating your vegetables. You know, I'll read it if I have to. Oh, okay, I'm done. You know, maybe that there's some element, because it can be difficult and it can be tricky. But again, the reason why I've titled this Discovering the Old Testament, or even Rediscovering the Old Testament, is there is not only a richness, a power, there is a joy, and there is a grace found within God's Word there in the Old Testament. That the better we know, the more blessed we are. The better we know the Old Testament, the better we will understand the New. Jesus himself is presented in the Gospels. Of that there is no doubt. They are the eyewitness accounts. His purpose and the meaning and how that impacts we who would follow him are certainly explained within the teachings and in the doctrines and theologies of the rest of the New Testament and the epistles. But if we want to get a full picture of who Jesus was as man, as God, if we want to understand where these theologies come from and how they're founded, if we want to meet God himself in his fullest, then I'm convinced we need to read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest both testaments as great gifts from God. Now, anybody remember the trick about how many books there are in the Old Testament? In the Old Testament? How many? Okay. OLD 1, 2, 3. 3. TESTAMENT 9. 39. 39 books. And the Old Testament. Yeah, it's very clever. It's neat. But if you start flipping through some of these books, I mean, it's like it's here and there and everywhere. I mean, there are these lengthy, long, dry sermons, and then there's like these some of the histories, and they're like action movies, and then there are these long stretches of poetry, and even some of the accounts of events and people and places, they sort of jump around. And it can be hard to tell, now wait a second, are we talking about the Babylonian exile, or are they back yet, or just till Egypt, or wait a second, when was Abraham again? It can get a little tricky to keep the pieces together, because it's not like one of the epistles, which lays stuff out, like lays out doctrine, or lays out teaching. It's not like one of the Gospels where you get these eyewitness accounts of Christ's life, and pretty much they start in the beginning, and pretty much they end at the end. And one story flows into the next, and you can go from book to book to book in the Old Testament, and it's radically different than the one just before, radically different than the one after. So how do you make sense of how it kind of bounces around, or the incredible amount of time that it covers? If you remember this from the last class, we're basically dealing with a period of time, as recorded in the Old Testament, from somewhere around 1400 BC to about 400 BC. So that's 1,000 years. That's roughly the time span that is covered through the events recorded in the Old Testament. So you're talking about books that were written over a 1,000-year period of time. Now think about 1,000 years, Anyone remember what happened in the Battle of Hastings?
1066.
1066, roughly 1,000 years ago. Now imagine a collection of writings from authors who occurred somewhere in that stretch between the Battle of Hastings in 1066 and today. Even if we were to limit it to just sort of English or early English works, we're talking about a single book that would contain stuff like Beowulf, stuff like King Arthur and Robin Hood, maybe the Canterbury Tales, bits of Shakespeare, and it also might have some of the Constitution. It might have something from Ayn Rand's Fountainhead. I don't know. It could even have something from somebody who's written a romance novel last year. I mean, we're talking about a big, big period of time. And so, partly by understanding this incredible swath of time, I think it gives us a little more openness to some of the diversity and the people and places and times. I mean, okay, it's 1,000 years. I need to expect a little bit of a range here. But I think when we take it in a proper perspective, the 1,000 years, I think, should also engender within us a deep respect, if not an awe, of the text. 1,000 years, and yet, when you read through the whole thing, you really can find this cohesive, coherent, unitive whole. There really is a narrative that works. It really works from start to finish. The fact that the Lord can preserve this, the fact that the Lord would offer this in the first place throughout that incredible diversity of time and experiences, and yet a single testament. That in and of itself, I think, shows great power and great grace. Let me give you something quite practical about the Old Testament. If you've got one of those Bibles right there at the table, I mean, just look at it for a second, okay? Your Bible from the side, okay? Now, if you were to just separate out Old to New Testament, this is what you're left with. Okay? Which one's the big one? Old Testament. That's right. Out of this entire Bible, it's got to be close to 3/4 of the entire Bible is the Old Testament. I don't know about you, but I'm not comfortable with saying we should be learning the Bible, but only 25%.
Yeah.
Okay? That by its sheer size and its magnitude, I think it says something about its relative importance within the scope of the Bible as a whole. But still, 1,000-year time span, dozens of authors, a diversity of subjects, and it's hard. Again, I picked that random passage, and it was weird, and it was almost scary. And I was having trouble with pronouncing the names, and I'm supposed to know this stuff. So, what do you make of a book that is that difficult to wrap your head around, to start figuring out how these things fit together, how the languages are working and the names and all this other sort of stuff? Well, it's like an awful lot of things that we desire to learn and to grow in, that we gain experience, and what from the outside looks incomprehensible, the more we do it and the more experience we gain, the more we understand, the easier it becomes. It might be your own field of study or field of expertise. It might be something, a hobby or interest. But someone from the outside looks at something that you can do or something that you know how and think, gosh, hey, you know what? I don't even get what they're doing. It makes no sense to me. We've got some knitters in here, right? I look at some of this stuff and I heard the knit one and the purl two, and it just loses me. And I'm quite amazed to think how just kind of wrapping stuff around, I mean, and you can produce these long, intricate, and beautiful things. I don't have the slightest idea. But if you've done it long enough, it kind of makes sense. You develop a pattern. You develop a rhythm. even the language and the lingo tends to sort of flow. I would like us to think if the Bible is God's love story to his people and consequently to us, that the Old Testament, that this is like a family inside story. It may make very little sense to the people outside of the family. But for those in the family who were there during that event or who said those words or remember them, they take on a new and very rich meaning. You kind of get it. Some of you have heard me talk about want to rent a tube, and that's referring to an event that happened in my family. I mean, it must have been, I don't know, 25 years ago. But the big extended family going on a tube trip down the Itchitucky River, and we stopped by a place to pick up the tubes, and it was a real humid day, and the guy had been in his garage, and he came out from the garage, and the moment he hit the air, his glasses just, steamed over completely. He was Mr. Magoo, and he sticks his head in the car. Can't say, want to rent a tube? And we laughed, and we laughed, and we laughed. The poor guy had no idea, but it just sort of struck us. It's not really that funny. It's just it's sort of a phenomenon of humidity and all. But it was so hilarious at the time. And that entire day, that whole weekend, we laughed about it, and it became probably the most memorable thing of that entire trip. 25 years later, I don't have to hear that phrase uttered for 10 years. But all it takes is one family member to say, want to rent a tube? I know exactly what they're talking about. Now, to an outsider, it makes no sense whatsoever. What? That's just dumb. Why are you laughing? Because they weren't there. And they don't know. But that is a shared story of my family. And though it may not make sense from the outside, if you were there, if you saw it, if you experienced it together, then these things make sense. And trust me, even after 25 years, it's still hilarious. So there are all sorts of things that we may know about because we desire to know, or we have this great experience, and what seems difficult or incomprehensible suddenly starts to make sense. I, for example, hate NASCAR. Now, there are probably people right now who want to challenge me to some kind of fight. And all I see are people making left turns. What in the world? What in the world? And yet, somebody who knows something sees far more than left turns. You see personalities. You see the skill. You see some guy in a car with a number, that's all I know, but you remember a story about how he came up in the ranks and that terrible crash he had 2 years ago and how he's doing it for his mother or whatever it is. Like, you see more because you know it and because you love it. From the outside looking in, American football can seem incomprehensible. You start seeing the X's and O's on a sheet, or you just start to watch it and they're like, now why do they keep starting and stopping, and why can they throw the ball but then they don't throw it, or some ways you can and some ways you can't, and what's the deal, why do they kick it away, and the points. I thought you said a touchdown with 6 points, why do they have 7? And it's very confusing. But the more time you spend into it, the more love that develops, the better you understand and know. And what seems confusing starts to make far more sense. You start seeing the puzzle pieces come together. These are not random guys who just kind of collide into each other and then stop. But you start seeing how the offensive and defensive lines face off against each other. You start seeing how it's not just guys who can run that way and try to catch a ball, but these very intricate plays are being formulated. And the more you know, and the more you love it, you start maybe identifying with a team or with a school, or I know now what it meant to be a Gator fan, that for year after year after year, you were the underachiever. You were the one who always said, well, wait till next year, because if there's some sort of heartbreaking way to lose at the last second, we would find it. And then came Spurrier, and we turned it all around. And now with Urban, we're going to new unprecedented heights. But it's only the guys who were there for Run, Lindsay, Run. who can really appreciate how far things have come. The Old Testament is just a family story. And it seems confusing, but the more you read it, the more you begin to love it. And the more you love it, the more you understand it. And the pieces come together. Sunday afternoons for me are pot roast at my grandmother's house. After church, the extended family would go over there. And a Sunday afternoon means my grandmother's pot roast. She would have the potatoes and the carrots there in the pan. She would make gravy her own special way. The TV would alternately have, yes, NASCAR, or Lawrence Welk. And she made this carrot jello, which I probably haven't tasted in over 20 years, but what I wouldn't give for one now. It might not mean anything to anyone outside of the family, but to anyone within my family, we all know. We all know. You only have to say one thing, and all of those experiences, all of those elements that I just told you, rush back into all of us, and you probably have stuff like that too. That's the Old Testament. It seems confusing on the outside because the foreignness turns us off, and we skim it, or we just sort of set it aside. But the more you dig in, the more you'll learn. The more you learn, the more I'm convinced you will see God's love pour out, and you will in turn love those stories. And the more you love them, the more sold you are on what's happening, the more vested you are on what's going on, then the more you will understand, for it will truly then be your story as well. It's what it's intended to be. But just like the difference between being in my grandmother's kitchen or being the neighbor who's peeking through the window, you got to come inside. You got to sit around the table. You got to eat a little pot roast, but then it can be your story too. All right. Why is the Old Testament important to have it as our story? What are you going to get out of it when you read it? Well, the Old Testament is different from the New Testament for several of the reasons that I've already mentioned. But let me go a little deeper. The Old Testament is very, very real. Now, by that, you may certainly take the implicit statement that these events actually happened. I believe that with all my heart, with all my mind, with all my soul and strength. But when I say they're real, I mean they're real like my life is real. They're a wreck, and they're a mess. You want real life? Look in the Old Testament. The best and the brightest and the worst and the most terrible. The gamut of emotions and feelings and experiences. People who do the most powerful, profound, humble, and faithful things, and those same great people who then do the stupidest and the worst and the most destructive things. The Old Testament is raw and it is real. If the New Testament tends to be kind of systematic, where it's maybe teaching doctrine and first this and then this, and this is how it all fits together, these are the things you ought to do. Well, the Old Testament is just like, it's just like sitting in someone's life with all of the drama within real life. The choices, the consequences. That this is life, real life with God. And it's real life with each other. It is a testament, a recording of what it's like to actually live with a God Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, on a practical, day-by-day, up and down, peak and valley sort of way. You don't have to look any further than the Psalms to see that gamut of human emotions, that full range of human experiences. You have Psalms that are filled with adoration and with joy and with praise, and some of them are very poetic and very flowery, and then some of them are just filled with loneliness and they're filled with sadness and grief. And there's some Psalms, they're filled with anger. There's a whole section of Psalms that's referred to sometimes as the imprecatory Psalms. Those are the ones where like, I want my enemies destroyed. I want their children to be without mothers. I wish that their babies were dashed against rocks. I want them obliterated. Does that uplift your spirit? Is it honest? Yes. Those are feelings that I've had one time. I mean, I may not be proud of it, but it's true. The Old Testament is true. It is honest. If the teaching of the epistles tends to present us the Christian life as it should be, the Old Testament shows us life as it really is. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Sometimes very, very ugly. But it's where we see God in the fullness of His power. We see God in the depth of His love and emotion for His people. We see how He treats us and how we respond. We see how that is lived on a daily basis and experienced generation after generation. It's the events and the facts on the ground. It's not so much about the things that you could or should do, but it's about examples, both positive and negative, about what God's people really did. And for that, I find myself. I find my own aches and desires and longings, my own successes and my own failures in the words of the Old Testament. I see warnings, and I see encouragements, and I see real stuff for real life, and for folks who don't live in stained glass, but who have real flesh and blood and bone, lead real lives with real choices, and make decisions that are really good and really bad. How God's love and faithfulness is constant. How His power is absolute. And how He is present within the life of His people, within the history of His people. What we see in the Old Testament is that God really cares, and our lives really count. Whether we do our best or whether we screw up royally. These are some things without the Old Testament we would not know. We, as in all of humanity, would not know that there is one God. Where does that come from? The Old Testament. Not a pantheon of gods, not the God of the sun and the God of the moon and the God of the grass and the God of the wind and the God of good classes and bad classes and the God of drinking your water and the God of casual slacks. But one God, an almighty God, a creative God, a God who in the beginning made all that there is, seen and unseen. We learn that there is a law, that there is right and there is wrong, and it supersedes customs and mores. It is something bigger, deeper, and more lasting and profound than any single king or ruler or culture. That there is something that it doesn't matter where you live or when you live, that is true, and that is right, and that is righteous. It's not the whim of the king to say, this is the law today, but tomorrow my mood will change. But there is something even deeper and greater than that comes from the very character of God. That there is right and wrong. There is good and bad. There is a way things ought to be, even if they so typically aren't. Through the Old Testament, we see a God of order in His creation. If it weren't for the character and the personality of God we see in the Old Testament, that He is faithful and that He is constant, we would have no way to feel reliable on what we see or what we know. The discipline of science must first come from the assumption that the physical nature of the world is itself constant and reliable. That it's not whimsical or capricious or changing. But where does that come from? It's not every culture or every land that teaches this. So many of them, with their pantheons of God, have a God who one day will dangle something good over you, and the next day will send rain and thunder, and there is just no way to know. But a God who says, this is my creation, and I maintain it, and it is constant. That comes from the Old Testament. Without that, there is no way to create the discipline of science. Because who knows what's going to happen next? I mean, sure, I drop the glass and it falls, but the next time, the God of gravity will change His mind. And it won't fall, it will go up. Likewise, within these whimsical, capricious gods, we have no way of knowing what's going to happen next, where we ought to be or ought to go. There is no sense of purpose or design beyond whatever the whim of that particular God might be. If they are fickle, and if they have no genuine care for us, then every day is just an accident waiting to happen. You don't know where things might lead, so you just put your head down and you keep going and you hope that today you don't run afoul of one of those gods who has the power to kill you outright. In the Old Testament, we see a God, however, who does not, with whim and capriciousness, change all the rules at all times. We see a God who hasn't just blindly placed us in a never-ending cycle to go over again the same thing again and again and again, but a God of purpose and a God of design. One who says He's got a plan. One who says, I've got a way and I want you to be a part of it. The working out through history will happen through the efforts and actions of His people as He directs and as He leads. Not faded, but now with a purpose. That's very different. And that comes first from the Old Testament. A God who doesn't have to speak through the dramatic to impress us, through the thunder, the lightning, and the earthquakes, fine. Where's the first time we see a God who may speak in a still small voice? It's the Old Testament. Our very notions of individuality, of freedom, of compassion, even our notion of justice, these come first from the Old Testament. And if you remove that from human history, all of those concepts have nowhere to come from. Though we may not understand all of the words, the legacy that has been imparted, we depend on it. We completely take it for granted. It is just so within our frame of mind and the way that we see the world and the way that we believe things, understand. It just simply is the way that it is without realizing. This is where it comes from. That's the kind of gift that God gave all of the world through the Old Testament. We may not always realize it or even articulate it, but it starts here. How do you know what God is like? How do you know about his passions and his power? How do you know about his love? The depth of his care? You find it first in the Old Testament. While God is most clear and most present to us in Jesus, the Old Testament is nothing but a rich reminder of the very character and nature of God himself. We want to talk about a God of grace and God of love. Don't say that's a New Testament God, and the Old Testament God is all wrath and fire and everything. A, there's wrath and fire in the New Testament. B, what are some of the predominant images that God either tells his people or instructs the prophets to use about himself? Well, how about shepherd? Remember the love and the care and the protection as shepherd? Where does God as Father start? It's not the New Testament. That's in the Old Testament. He's the Father to his people. He is the Father of the fatherless. And God is lover of his people. A husband who will chase after an unfaithful wife. A lover who is rejected and scorned again and again by the beloved, but will go to any length or to any distance to draw her back. If that sounds like Jesus, well, it's true, because that's the very nature of God, and it's there in the very beginning, there in the Old Testament. This is it's a story of God and his people, a story of God and Israel. Israel, the name given to Jacob, meaning quite simply struggles with God. And it's an account of that relationship of struggle with God and his chosen people, and how God will reach and draw in and bless and love and care. And Israel, they will struggle with God, struggle with each other, and they will stray, they will run, they will reject, they will suffer because of those consequences. And even in their suffering, God reaches again to draw in and to bless and to love, and again and again and again. It's the story of God struggling with Israel. But remember how this is real life? That's the story how God struggles with me. Pretty sure that's the way how God struggles with you. He reaches out for you, and he brings you in, and he loves you, and he cares for you, and you turn away. You get distracted. You forget. You wander. Maybe you out and out reject. And we suffer. We struggle. But doesn't he reach again? And again, and again, and again. Remember, the Old Testament is our story too. You just have to stop peeking through the window. Come on inside and sit down. Have a little roast. Watch a little Lord's Welk. You'll see it's your story too. On this sheet, you will see a general breakdown of the books of the Old Testament, and how generally in our Bibles we tend to group them in these sort of large sections. The Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, that was in all likelihood the Bible that Jesus would have been reading and quoting from, uses these typical designations, but the older form of the grouping, where you would have all of these scrolls after scrolls after scrolls, not a book, but maybe a wall filled with various scrolls, each representing one of the various books. The longer books with gigantic, long, impossibly long scrolls. The shorter books with very small ones. But often referred to as the Tanakh in Hebrew. Now, Tanakh is simply using these designations to break down the break down the books of the Old Testament, and then taking the first letter of each and pronouncing them. So T, N, and K. If you ever come across one, I have one floating around somewhere, but a Tanakh is the typically from the Masoretic text, but the Hebrew Old Testament, and it's grouped and ordered differently. It's not radically different, but if you look on the back, you will see the order of the Tanakh. And it's grouped in ways that take similar books, either similar in theme or in purpose, in content or in time, and it groups them together. In the T, Torah. Those first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, the books of Moses, those are the books of law. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That takes us from the very beginning, like the beginning of everything, and sees the formulation of creation, humanity, and God eventually drawing from that humanity His chosen people. Now, He chooses these people because they're the best and the brightest, right? Out of all the people of the earth, He picks out Abraham because he's the most awesome. No. Abraham is... I like Abraham, don't get me wrong. Abraham does some really wonderful stuff, and it is reckoned to him as righteousness. And then Abraham does some really, really stupid things. And Abraham does some awful things. Like trying to prostitute out his own wife. Not so good. God calls out Abraham and chooses this people from this line of this creaky old couple because He simply loves them. They're not the best. They're not the brightest. They're not the strongest or most powerful, but God loves them. And because the Old Testament reminds us again and again and again that God is present in history and He works through and with His people, then it's not about the best and the brightest clawing to the top of the heap. It's about God loving this family and just pouring forth those blessings within His plan. Remember, there's a purpose to this life and this creation. God's got a plan. It's not random. And it's not cyclical. He's got a plan. He is working it out in His own way through these people whom He loves. The Torah will bring us to that event through the founding of Israel as a nation into their captivity and eventually their exodus, their release from slavery in Egypt and the wandering in the desert. The Nevi'im, the book of the prophets. Now, in the Greek way of ordering, which is how our Bibles are ordered, we tend to break them into the major prophets and the minor prophets. That has nothing to do with their importance. It has everything to do with their size. Okay? Daniel's like this big. Habakkuk was like this big. I mean, it's just one of those things. We've got Amos, which is typically recorded in like maybe 3 pages. And we've got Isaiah that goes on and on and on, 60 plus chapters. The major prophets are simply the long ones. The minor prophets are the small ones. In the Tanakh, or Hebrew ordering, all of the prophets are together. This is God speaking through chosen vessels to His people. Again, relating, and sometimes it's messy, and sometimes it's hard, and there is that constant struggle. God reaches to His people, loves them, blesses them, and they go running off to go do their own stupid thing. They get themselves in trouble, and then God chases them down and brings them back, only to have them do it all over again, and yet God's overarching plan is still being worked out, mostly despite ourselves. And it is through these prophets where God communicates to His people and through His people. and the Ketuvim, sort of everything else. It could be translated as writings or as scriptures, but even those have these kind of subheadings: the books of truth, the 5 scrolls, the writings. This is where you get stuff like, in the Greek word, we would say the wisdom literature, like, Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Psalms. Or we would also have in here the books of later history, like Ezra and Nehemiah, the Chronicles, the things that happened after the Babylonian captivity, the events close to the end of the Old Testament age. Important to see the distinction, I think, between the two ordering. Not because it necessarily reveals a deep and profound truth, but I think by just seeing some of the ways that it orders, we begin to see these books as less independent and more interconnected. If anything, by seeing the two different orderings, the Greek and the Hebrew ordering, it may help underscore the fact that they're actually connected in more ways than we might typically assume. You might not put together, for example, Esther and Lamentations. The Hebrew ordering does. You might not put together Joshua and Ezekiel. The Hebrew ordering does. Now, the Greek ordering would call Joshua a book of history, Ezekiel a major prophet. Now, there is something to be learned when you see that Joshua happens in line with Judges and Ruth and 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel. But these are a recording of events that have occurred. And we see people and places and times and dates and events. But then there might also be something in seeing why in the world would something like Joshua or something like Judges be considered part of the prophets? It's weird. Or is it? Does not God speak through Joshua? Does not God raise up his judges to protect, defend, or heal his people? And they speak his words as well. People like Deborah. People like Gideon. Historical events. Okay, that's one way to see how they all fit together. Also, God reaching out and speaking to, okay, making more connections here. Sometimes, by just picking a book out and reading it, you're missing the context, you're missing all of the points. This is like somebody simply saying water in a tube. It makes very little sense out of its context. But the more you see how it's connected to other things, the more pieces of the story begin to come together. That's where the fogged up glasses come in. That's where the family comes in. That's where how funny the guy's expression comes in. And the more you see these interconnections, the better we understand and the richer we see what it is that we are intended to see. We'll be following a little more of the Hebrew ordering as we go through our next classes. Primarily so we can get a handle on this narrative. That within each grouping, the narrative, I think, is the most clear. When we say the Torah or the Pentateuch, when we take those 5 books together and we start to read through the events, we start to see God's plan a little more clearly than we would if we just picked out, say, Numbers and Malachi. But at the same time, by taking an ordering that might be less familiar for us, I think there's some connections here that we might not always see as we're looking through the historical narrative, this event, this time, this person. This ordering, I think, helps underscore God's own purpose and his own plan. That even through these historical figures and historical events, it is God himself raising people up, speaking through them, and using them to bless his people and to draw them back. This is a chance then to see it not just as a collection of confusing, incomprehensible books filled with names impossible to pronounce, events in faraway lands, and customs that kind of freak us out, but a chance to see how this great story unfolds, like the petals in a flower. If you force it open, it never blossoms and it dies. But you allow it to gradually come open, you nourish it and nurture it, and you see those petals that had been compact and compressed begin to open up and stand on their own, and yet present you with a beautiful and complete whole. The Old Testament is tough. I'm going to be honest. It's an honest book, so I'll be honest with you. It's not easy, but it's worth it. The rewards there, that's worth it. It may take some effort from the beginning, but once you start picking it up, once you get the rhythm, once you get the cadence, once you know the lingo, it all starts to roll. It all starts to fit. The flower can blossom for you. And over these next 3 weeks, it will be my hope and my prayer that together as we dig in, we will read this real and raw story of God and His people, the struggles throughout His creation, and that we will begin, or in a new way, see it as our story too. Real, sometimes raw, but true.